Below the threshold, beyond the threshold and cause significant harm, then you are breaching into a legally protected right of others. So the irony in the Nile Basin is the entirety of the flow belongs to Egypt and Sudan. The share of others is not determined, not even recognized. So you just can't, it doesn't make sense to speak about harm in circumstances where the rights don't exist in definitive form. Therefore, that must be taken into account. And this process was halted because Egypt and Sudan walked out of the process. By walking out, they deliberately and vehemently rejected the approach of international. They just rejected the legal framework, and they are actually like the lawbreakers. They are the deal. They destroyed a deal and yet claim to be victims.
But what I want to stress upon is when we're talking about no significant harm or equitable use, as Dr. mentioned earlier, it's not on a project basis. The major problem in the Nile Basin, and that translates to the major problem in the GERD, is that we don't have this framework for sharing of the water. So now we're dealing with an entity who is so used to having the whole cookie that any amount of sharing, any amount of loss, as Dr. mentioned earlier, seems like a huge injustice. So we have to see the negotiations and the dealings around the feeling from that light as well, because technically it's not a complicated situation. The technical people can come and have come to an arrangement. It's when you look at it from this political perspective that things become more complicated. So there's harm, and then there's significant harm. And one really key thing to stress is the concept of causing no significant harm is capped by, that's a good word, is capped by this equitable and reasonable use. You can't talk about causing no significant harm unless you have that framework of equitable use. So had it been the case that in the Nile Basin we had this equitable and reasonable allocation, and Ethiopia was entitled to X amount of water and Egypt was entitled to Y amount of water, this filling of the dam wouldn't have been an issue. As long as we are within our equitable share, then we could do whatever we want with our share of the water. And then it's only when we go beyond that share that we cause significant harm to other countries. So then it becomes clear. But without that framework of equitable use in place, you can't really talk about what harm means, what significant harm means. So we're negotiating in the dark now, based off of nothing, which means everything is going to be an issue. So how, as you mentioned earlier, how the dam operates, we need some time to fill the dam, and while we fill the dam, the amount of water reaching downstream will be reduced. That's a fact. So it's a matter of balancing the time we need to fill the dam with the amount of water, the amount of reduced water that reaches downstream. But as Dr. mentioned earlier, developments are inevitable, and we have to learn to live with minor inconsistencies, minor inconveniences. But these minor inconveniences are portrayed as significant harm because, again, we're dealing with a person who is used to having the whole cake and not wanting to share. So looking scientifically, technically at it, the filling and operation of the dam should not be such a big issue. It's only when you look at it in light of in light of the political situations and like these framing of existential attachment and existential need for the Nile that it becomes complicated. Because if we had that arrangement, then we would play within those limits of shares that each country has, but we don't have that now. And so that's why the filling and the operation of the dam is an issue now, because we really don't have any guidelines to play with. We're just like dealing in the dark, negotiating in the dark, which makes things a lot more complicated than they should be.
Speaking the main dispute of Egypt and Ethiopia these days is going to be on the filling and the operation of the dam, right? This means Egypt has no doubt on the building of the dam. What do you say about it?
That's a position that has evolved. If you remember when the dam was first launched, it was like you were not going to build it. And then it was like, okay, then it's not going to grow. And we just kept moving, and now you're not going to fill it. So you can't help but evolve with the progress of the situation. So yes, the main agreement now is on the filling and annual operation of the dam, as it was highlighted in the DOP.
Dr. You got my point, right? Egypt and Ethiopia locked horn when we see on every media, like it can be print or broadcast. Egypt and Ethiopia got disputes on the filling and annual operation of the water, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean Egypt has no complaint on the construction of dam?
Well, like Magdala had said, Egypt swallowed the bitter reality that the dam is there. They never wanted any development to take place upstream, but it became a reality. But the biggest sad thing, the third reality about all this discussion is that the issue of the Nile water utilization, which is fundamentally an issue of law and equity and fairness, is reduced to the discussion of the technicalities of a particular dam, which should never have been tabled. It is a pure national project, entirely funded by a country not so rich. And it should have remained a national project. And I would say, by tabling the dam for a trilateral discussion, we have deprived ourselves of a very potent instrument, which would have been a leverage to bring these rebels into the framework of law. It's almost a cliche of the West. They say, we don't negotiate with terrorists, so let's have minimum rules of decency for interaction. That should have been the case, because by rejecting the cooperative framework agreement, in the negotiation of which they took part for over 10 years, they rejected it at the 11th hour, they have discredited themselves as worthy partners in any meaningful negotiation. We should have taken our lesson in 2010. But unfortunately, the 2015 DOP came, and there started our journey downwards. And we have to deal with the trouble that's coming from that, I call it a strategic mistake on the part of Ethiopia. It's good to be friendly in terms of relationships, but in international relations, the rule of the game is reciprocity. Okay, you don't do charity, you don't play nice to your neighbors, and neighbors like Egypt and Sudan. We have ample historical evidence to prove that we should beware while dealing with them. Therefore, it is a problem which shouldn't have existed. That's my position. It's a problem which shouldn't have existed, because both Egypt and Sudan had their moments of launching mega projects. The Egyptians, when they started to build the Aswan Dam on the basis of the 1959 agreement, and Ethiopia did in 1957, 5 centuries nearly. What exactly Sisi did in a mischievous way now, there was news of Egypt and Sudan negotiating for a second treaty, 1959 treaty, and Ethiopia felt its exclusion to be unfair. We are the source of the water. We have our development potentials rooted in it, and we shouldn't be excluded, and we should be involved. And they didn't give a fig about it, so they went on. So Ethiopia had to send a diplomatic aid memoir to the international community, making clear that by its exclusion is not appropriate, and Ethiopia reserved its right to make use of the water for current and future generations. They never consulted us. Sudan did the same with the construction of the Merowe mega dam. They never cared to consult anybody. Why should we? And for nothing in return. And at a moment when they have rejected and refused addressing the issue within the context of law in a civilized way. Okay.
Good.
May I add something?
You can.
I resonate with what Doctor is saying, but I also see the GERD as a project, a mega project on a transboundary river course, as a very good platform to foster this transboundary cooperation. The CFA is on standstill now. 6 countries have signed it, 4 have ratified it, and we need 2 more to make it the law of the land per se. And because of situations that the doctor clearly explained earlier, it's not moving forward. But I see it is indeed, it makes complete sense to me, and I resonate with that as an Ethiopian with what the doctor explained now. But I also see the GERD as a very good platform to foster these collaborations, taking the high road when we didn't need to, initiating this international panel of experts and this tripartite discussions between these countries. It's a way of showing goodwill on our side, on the Ethiopian side. You can also look at the statement made by the president when there was that tone of violence and belligerence on the side of Sisi. What our president did was a measured. What our president said was in a measured tone, really rooted in international legal agreements. So I see Ethiopia as taking the high road in terms of these negotiations and doing things that we were not legally entitled to. We don't need to, because this reciprocity needs to exist, but still taking the high road as we are now, initiating these discussions when we don't need to, showing our goodwill on the side of the country, while also having red lines and being really deeply rooted in international agreements, I think can be a good way to foster transboundary collaboration, also get these silent upstream riparian countries into the conversation and actually move what the NBI, the Nile Basin Initiative, was made for, and actually push the CFA through the finish line. I know this is an optimistic view, but I also see value and credits what is being done now, things which actually we don't need to, as a show of goodwill. And I think this will pay us forward, not just us as Ethiopians, but the basin as a whole. So I do see virtue in the things that Ethiopia is doing now, even though we are not legally entitled to, and even though there's no legal framework, as it was explained earlier, that necessitates us doing these things. But I really do feel they would have some fruit for going forward on a basin scale.
Good. Okay. Can we possibly say the upstream countries are privileged over using the Nile than that of the downstream countries?
It's not a matter of privilege. So Ethiopia, for example, is geographically ideal to use water for hydropower. In that sense, can you say Ethiopia is privileged? If you do, then...
Geographically speaking, in the meantime, the water source is Ethiopia, right? Specifically, let's talk about Ethiopia only. Do we have privilege over using it of the Nile than that of other countries?
No, by no means. I go back to the statement made by the doctor earlier. Share of a transboundary water course is not about privilege. It comes by virtue of you as in the country, being part of that river course, water course. So it's not a matter of privilege. We can say that Egypt and Sudan have been privileged in the past to using the Nile because of historical circumstances, but as far as legal, equitable share is concerned, no country is privileged over another. We are entitled to our fair share. We have that right, but it's not a matter of privilege. I wouldn't describe it like that. Ethiopia is the source of the water, the source of the majority of the water, 86% of the water. But there's also the White Nile, which passes through these other upper riparian countries. They also contribute to the water. They are as privileged like us, like Sudanese, like Egypt, in using the water in that sense. So it's not really a matter of privilege. And it's also not something we can help. Whether we like it or not, we are tied by this river, 11 countries are tied by this river, a natural phenomena, and you can't turn your back to it. Whether you like it or not, you are connected. So framing it in terms of privilege, historical right, it really doesn't serve the purpose. Fact of the matter is population is increasing, demand for water will rise, and we do need a way of using the water cooperatively if we are to secure water, secure basic needs for all of these riparian countries. So talking about the water use and the right to the water in terms of privilege, historical right, I don't think serves the purpose at all. It's not a matter of privilege, really.
Good, Doctor.
Maybe the point you raised may be seen from a different perspective. In transboundary water course utilization, geographic position matters. And the fact that we are upstream and we are a source puts us in a natural geographic advantage over other riparian countries. But if we're speaking about utilization of a shared water in the framework of a legal institutional framework, it just doesn't matter whether you are upstream, midstream, and downstream, or you are contributing even 100% of the flow. It just doesn't give you any superior right, all riparian countries. So it brings back the question, who in the circumstances of the Nile should be begging for cooperation, you see? So either we operate within the framework of legality, or we go on our way unilaterally. Who is going to lose most? So, and one thing to be noted is international law requires basin states to cooperate to work out a reasonable and equitable utilization pattern. But to use a resource within its territory is a sovereignly recognized right. We don't have to beg anybody. We don't have to secure the consent or even cooperation of any of the riparian countries to make use of our water resources. The way Egypt and Sudan never cared to consult others. So we can go ahead with our projects, making sure that we're not encroaching upon the rights. In the context of the Nile, it's very hard to tell. Where you don't know the boundaries of your right, you cannot speak about violation of those rights. So if unilateralism is to prevail, as it has in the past, we are at a natural and geographic advantage, to put it. So it should have been otherwise. Egypt and Sudan, which would be affected most in the absence of cooperation, should have been knocking at our doors for a cooperation and for a deal, rather than them walking out of a deal and then us pursuing them into negotiation and all sorts of things.
To substantiate what the doctor is saying now, a famous example would be the Mekong River Basin in Asia, which is shared by 5 countries, including China, and China happens to be an upstream country. And as the doctor mentioned, it's the downstream countries which are literally begging for an agreement, because as an upstream country, and if that I think that was the point you're trying to make, you can substantially make use of the water, which would cause significant harm to the others if you just wanted to go your way. So China just keeps building dams. It doesn't really care to concern downstream countries. It's not even part of the framework even now. And it's downstream riparian countries which are actually initiating and begging for cooperation in the basin. So in that sense, as an upstream country, as a country which gets the water first, if you acted unilaterally, yes, you do have that privilege in that sense. So the situation would be that downstream countries would actually want and prefer a regulatory framework for using the water. But in the Nile Basin, because of historical circumstances, it's the other way around. But considering geography, for example, Ethiopia might be suited for hydropower, and getting the water first might allow us to use the water however way we want. But still, that's not, I don't consider that a privilege.
Doc, in 2015, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt agreed on a declaration of principle. What was that about?
Yeah, it was about the GERD, agreement on the declaration of principles on the GERD. It purportedly appears to be a deal on the GERD, but if you just go through and look at the content, it goes far beyond a specific project. But to answer your question very briefly, it is an agreement about the GERD. Like I said, the conclusion of that treaty is a wrong turn in Ethiopia's position. And what we are facing now is a consequence of us becoming part of that that deal. So it talks about how the dam is to be filled, the purpose of the dam is determined to be power generation. It talks about cooperation, it talks about no significant harm, equitable utilization, dispute settlement, all sorts of things. But generally it is a project-specific agreement which should never have existed. It's a national project. We should have remained a national project. Any concerns and worries of other countries could have been addressed through other diplomatic channels. We didn't need to go into that deal, and now we're paying for it.
Good, Doctor. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being built with a finance generated from each and every citizen in the country. What would have happened if the money is donated by IMF, World Bank, or other donors?
Well, I think that's an impossible scenario. The GERD wouldn't have been if we had waited for funding from outside. It's because of exactly the circumstance that we haven't been able to use to make any developments on the Nile waters. Dealings on the Nile are highly geopolitical. They're not just technical or economic, and these funder companies, funder organizations, really do make sure to keep the interest of Egypt in mind when we talk about any infrastructure or any development on the Nile, let alone on a project at the scale of the GERD. So I don't think GERD would have been a possibility if the money had come from outside. I don't think that would have happened. But part of the value of the GERD, at least for me, comes from it being a national project, comes from it being fully funded by the money of the people. You know, we're not a rich country. We're not a country with surplus. Everybody's giving. Everybody's contributing to the GERD by actually taking away from something that's necessary. That forms the social morale, the social attachment with the dam for me. So I actually appreciate the fact that the GERD is being built by our own money, by our own resources. Just look at history to see whether IMF or any World Bank or any other major funder would have done this. They don't.
They're gonna bargain.
No, what I mean to say is I don't think we would have reached a stage where we would need to bargain on the GERD, or like there we'd need to manipulate the GERD. I don't think it would even be started. And going back to my point, the fact that the dam is being built entirely by the contribution of its citizens adds to the value of beyond being an infrastructure which produces electricity. It also forms part of the social dignity, the social pride, the social morale. Just look at the initiation and this renewed passion for the Nile waters and for the country and for development that has happened just because of the launching of the project. It's not even done. Even the launching had significant impact. So imagine what kind of impact it's going to have when it's actually done, and when it's actually a beacon of hope for other projects as well. So I'm actually glad that we're doing this on our own resources, but I don't think the GERD would have been possible had funding come from outside. I just don't see it.
I think one point to add, it's a World Bank operational policy not to fund mega projects in the absence of an agreement. So in a way, World Bank policy gives veto power for downstream riparian countries. So it couldn't be funded.
Okay, good. Why Sudan refrained from complaining on the GERD, unlike Egypt?
Well, Sudan had, the Sudanese government had their own complaints. It's different from the complaints of Egypt. It mostly had to do with dam security, dam safety, because the dam is quite close to their borders. That was one of the main issues. But the difference, at least how I see it, the difference between complaints in Sudan versus Egypt is at least the Sudanese seem to acknowledge the benefits that they would get to the GERD. So it's kind of a compromise between, okay, how much is our liability versus how much is the benefits. And it is because of these acknowledgement of the benefits that they would actually get from the GERD that we saw these initial support for the GERD, and for quite some time they were pretty lenient on their oppositions, and it wasn't as how do you say it? It wasn't as forceful. The disagreements and the opposition wasn't as forceful as Egypt. But by no means the Sudan's, and by no means can we say that the Sudanese are not complaining about the GERD. They do have their own concerns. Only those concerns are different from Egypt, and also rooted in a different cause. For Egypt, it's an existential threat. It's about securing this age-old right to unlimited use of the water. At least I don't see it that way when it comes to the Sudanese.
Well, I have one serious concern about our perception of Sudan's position vis-a-vis the entire Nile issue and the GERD in particular. Well, how do you measure the stand or position of a particular country on a given issue of concern? Is it on the basis of some sound bites given by diplomats and negotiators on happy moments, or what? So if you measure by objective position of Sudan with regards to the Nile water in its entirety and the GERD, it's no different from Egypt. They don't shout, because if one of the parties is doing the shouting, the other must play another tone. And there's no better evidence to prove Sudan's position than its rejection of the CFA. It even walked out of the Nile Basin Initiative when Egypt walked out, to come back only after a few years. So we shouldn't have any illusions about being friends. So are not restricted to Sudan. They extend to Egypt. It benefits them. They know it. We can't tell them how useful it is.
Okay.
But the question is, are they really willing to recognize our right as source countries to a significant change in their narrative as exclusive owners? So do they really recognize our right to make use of the water?
Dr. Dereje and Magdala, thank you for your expertise. I really appreciate.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you've been watching Talk to OBN show. Thank you for watching.